somewhere between 3,000 and 20,000 people. That's the actual range you get when you line up every credible estimate of how many Iranians were killed by their own government in a single month this year, and the fact that the range is that wide should tell you something on its own before we even get into the details. This isn't a story about missiles or bunker busters or bridges. This is a story about what's been happening inside Iran's own borders, largely in the dark, while most of the world's attention stayed locked on the war. I went through Amnesty International's published investigations, Iran human rights verified casualty tracking, a UN Special Rapporteur's public statements, a formal UK government country assessment, IMF economic data, and direct on-the-ground reporting from outlets that actually had journalists physically present in Tehran to put this together. And I want to walk you through it carefully, because the scale of what's actually happening here deserves more than a headline, and it deserves more care with the numbers than a lot of the coverage that has existed has given it. I want to say up front that a story like this one sits differently than a strike report or a military breakdown, because we're talking about a documented mass loss of civilian life inside a country's own borders at the hands of its own government. I'm going to walk through the actual sourced numbers the same careful way I always do, but I don't want that careful, sourced tone to come across as clinical detachment from what this actually represents for the families involved. These are real people, and the scale here is genuinely one of the worst domestic crackdowns anywhere in the world this decade, however you land on the exact figure within that wide range. Let's start at the beginning, because the timeline actually matters for understanding why this got so bad so fast. On December 28th of last year, protests broke out in Tehran's Bazaar district, sparked initially by a sharp collapse in the value of Iran's currency, the rial. This wasn't a political protest to start with. It was merchants and shopkeepers reacting to their own currency becoming worthless in their hands, but it didn't stay that way. Within days, the protests spread out of Tehran and into other cities, and the chants shifted from economic grievances to direct calls against the government itself, spreading eventually to all 31 of Iran's provinces, and something like 120 cities before the government could get any kind of handle on it. The government's response escalated in stages, and the most consequential single decision came on January 8th, when Iranian authorities shut down internet access nationwide. That's not a small detail. It's actually central to why this story has been so hard to cover accurately, because from that point forward, verified information leaving the country slowed to a trickle. Independent journalists, human rights monitors, foreign governments, all of them were suddenly working from fragments, smuggled footage, and secondhand accounts, rather than the kind of real-time documentation that usually accompanies a major news event now. According to reporting compiled in a formal UK government country assessment on the protests, most of the deaths that have since been verified through video evidence from morgues, including footage showing hundreds of body bags, some with names written directly on them, happened specifically on January 8th, the day the blackout began. So let's talk about the actual numbers, because this is where you have to be careful, and where I think a lot of coverage either inflates or undersells what happened depending on the source. Iran's own government, through its Supreme Council of National Security, put out an official figure on January 21st of 3,117 people killed during the unrest. That's the government's own number, and even that, on its own, would represent one of the deadliest crackdowns on protesters anywhere in the world this decade. But independent human rights monitors have consistently put the toll significantly higher. Iran Human Rights, a Norway-based organization that verifies deaths through hospitals, morgues, and at least 2 independent sources before counting a death, had confirmed 648 killed by January 12th, with the organization itself explicitly cautioning that unverified reports at that point already ran into the several thousands, and some estimates as high as 6,000. By January 28th, that same organization's tracking, cited in the UK government's own bulletin, had risen to 6,221 confirmed deaths, including 5,858 identified as protesters specifically, with an additional 17,091 deaths still under investigation at that point, a category that exists precisely because of the internet blackout made full verification impossible in real time. Separately, the United Nations' own Special Rapporteur on Iran, a human rights lawyer named Mai Sato, appointed specifically to monitor the country, said in a media interview on January 16th that at least 5,000 people had been killed, and that medical sources she'd been in contact with suggested the real total could be as high as 20,000. Amnesty International, which has spent decades documenting Iranian state violence going back through the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising and the 2019 protests before that, called January 2026 the deadliest period of repression by Iranian authorities in the organization's entire history of research on the country, which, given Iran's track record over the past 2 decades, is a genuinely significant statement for a human rights organization to make on the record. I want to sit with that range for a second. 3,000 on the low end from the government itself. up toward 20,000 on the high end from a sitting UN human rights official, because I think the honest takeaway isn't picking whichever number sounds most dramatic. It's understanding that even the floor of this range, the number the Iranian government itself admits to, describes one of the most violent state crackdowns anywhere in the world in recent memory, and that the ceiling of the range, if it holds up under further investigation, would place this among the deadliest domestic crackdowns of the 21st century. Full stop. Amnesty's own on-the-ground documentation in the crackdown's opening days is worth mentioning specifically here, too, because it shows the pattern wasn't uniform panic, it was geographically concentrated in specific ways. Between December 31st and January 3rd alone, working jointly with Human Rights Watch, Amnesty verified at least 28 killings across 13 cities and 8 provinces, with the heaviest tolls concentrated in Loristan and Ilam, provinces home to Iran's Kurdish and Luri ethnic minorities, a detail that fits a long documented pattern of Iranian security forces responding with disproportionate lethal force in regions with large ethnic minority populations. Other provinces recording deaths in that same early window included Chaharmahal and Bakhtiari, Fars, and Kermanshah, each with at least 4 confirmed killings, along with Esfahan, Hamadan, and Qom, each recording at least 1. That spread across nearly a third of the country's provinces within the crackdown's first several days gives you a sense of just how immediately widespread the government's lethal response became, rather than being isolated to Tehran or any single flashpoint city. And it's consistent with a security apparatus that had clearly pre-planned a nationwide, rather than localized, response well before the protests themselves reached their peak. And this wasn't a crackdown that spared children. Human rights organizations, including the human rights activists' news agency, known as Harana and Iran Human Rights, had by late January verified the identities of at least 118 children and adolescents killed during the protests, out of more than 42,000 total arrests, of which 326 were themselves minors. Most of those young victims died from gunshot wounds or injuries caused by riot control weapons during street clashes, and Iranian authorities, for their part, have generally declined to release any official breakdown by age, in several cases simply attributing the deaths to what they described as terrorists or rioters, regardless of the age of the person killed. Khamenei himself, before his death in the strike that opened the war with the US, and Israel in late February, publicly acknowledged in a speech on January 17th that thousands had been killed, while blaming President Trump and accusing protest organizers of ties to the United States and Israel. That's a notable admission on its own, a sitting supreme leader confirming, in his own words, a death toll in the thousands, even while the regime's official statistics office was working to land on a lower formal number days later. It's worth understanding how broad this unrest actually became, because it wasn't confined to any single demographic or region, which is part of what made it so alarming to the government in the first place. According to reporting on the protests' spread, workers in Iran's oil sector and members of the country's truckers' union joined the strikes alongside the original bazaar merchants and students, a combination that carries real historical weight in Iran specifically, because oil worker strikes were one of the decisive factors that helped topple the Shah's government back in 1979. When merchants, students, oil workers, and truckers all converge on the streets at the same time, that's not a narrow, single-issue protest movement. That's a cross-section of the country's actual economic backbone, expressing the same grievance simultaneously, and Iranian security planners would have understood that historical echo as well as anyone. The government's own response to the economic side of the crisis says something too. Faced with soaring prices and a currency in freefall, authorities rolled out a nationwide monthly food coupon system in January, an emergency measure aimed at heading off what officials themselves reportedly described internally as the worst economic crisis the country had faced since the 1979 revolution itself. On December 31st, in the middle of the initial unrest, the government even declared a nationwide holiday, shutting down offices and schools entirely, apparently hoping that pausing ordinary public life might cool tensions. It didn't work. Demonstrations continued spreading anyway, eventually reaching all 31 provinces despite the shutdown. There is also a leadership decision worth noting here because it shows the government wasn't monolithic even in how it chose to respond. President Masoud Pezeshkian's approach to the unrest reportedly differed sharply from what his more hardline predecessor, the late Ebrahim Raisi, would likely have done. Rather than immediately reaching for maximum repression, Pezeshkian initially acknowledged the public's right to protest, a notably different posture than the brutal, near-instant crackdowns that characterized the 2019 and 2022 protest waves. That approach didn't ultimately prevent the crackdown that followed once the protests kept spreading and calls for regime change intensified. But it's a detail that complicates any simple story of a single, unified Iranian government response, and it hints at exactly the kind of internal factional tension between more pragmatic and more hardline figures that's continued showing up throughout this entire crisis, right up through the disputed reports about this month's succession ceremony. Now here's where this story gets genuinely underreported, because the protest didn't simply end, and the country didn't simply move on once the war with the EU. Hess and Israel began on February 28th. If anything, the war layered directly on top of an already traumatized, already grieving population, and the economic collapse that sparked the original protests never actually reversed. It just got compounded. By mid-July of this year, according to the state-run Jahan A. Sanat newspaper's own reporting on July 11th, the IMF was projecting a negative 5.4% contraction in Iran's GDP for 2026, an extraordinary economic collapse for any country, not already in the middle of a formal famine or total state failure. United Nations data cited in the same period showed Iran attracting barely $1.6 billion in foreign direct investment for the entire year, a trickle for an economy of Iran's size, reflecting just how thoroughly international capital has fled the country amid the compounding sanctions, war damage, and political instability. The currency itself has continued its collapse, well past the protests that it originally triggered. When the US and Iran signed their Memorandum of Understanding back in June, there was a brief window of stabilization in Iran's currency markets, the first real relief Iranian households had seen in months. But when the ceasefire collapsed again in early July, and American strikes resumed, that stabilization evaporated within days. Reporting on Iran's free currency markets described the dollar's value against the rial spiking past, a level that erased essentially all of the gains from the June agreement almost overnight, a level so extreme that it functionally wiped out whatever confidence ordinary Iranians had started to rebuild in their own currency over that brief ceasefire window. Even Iran's own state-run press, which normally exists to project stability and confidence, has started acknowledging the scale of what's happening. The state-run Fararu website published a warning on July 7th, describing what it called severe economic erosion and the declining resilience of society, explicitly acknowledging that the majority of the country's population is under the pressure of inflation. A few days later, the state-run Javan newspaper reportedly conceded that long-term economic inequality is systematically undermining the country from within. When a country's own state media, which exists specifically to manage public perception on behalf of the government, starts using language like severe erosion and declining resilience, that's a meaningful signal about how bad the underlying numbers actually are, because state media in a system like Iran's doesn't typically volunteer bad news unless the reality has become too visible to paper over entirely. There's also been a specific, well-documented crisis of leadership legitimacy running alongside all of this economic pain, and it's one that's actually been covered by credible outlets, even if it hasn't gotten the volume of attention the war itself has received. When Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening strike of the war on February 28th, his son Mojtaba was named as his successor by Iran's Assembly of Experts on March 8th. But Mojtaba, who was reportedly injured in the same strike that killed his father, then simply didn't appear in public for months. When his father's days-long state funeral finally took place in early July, more than 4 months after the assassination, delegations from Russia, China, Iraq, and other allied governments attended ceremonies in Tehran, Qom, Najaf, Karbala, and finally Mashhad, where the elder Khamenei was ultimately buried on July 9th. Mojtaba never showed up to any of it. Iranian television did show 3 of his brothers, Mostafa, Maysam, and Masoud, praying behind their father's coffin. But the man who was supposed to be the new supreme leader of the country remained entirely absent from public view through the whole ceremony. That absence became its own story, reported directly by outlets with journalists physically present in Tehran. One mourner interviewed by Al Jazeera at the funeral described the situation in almost theological terms, comparing belief in Mojtaba's continued existence and leadership to religious faith itself, something you don't see but choose to believe in anyway. That's a genuinely striking thing for an ordinary citizen to say about their own head of state on the record to a foreign news crew, and it captures something real about the uncertainty running through the country at exactly the moment its government most needed to project strength and continuity. Analysts at the Atlantic Council have separately described Mojtaba as more ideologically hardline than his father, with close ties to some of the country's most extremist clerics, which raises its own separate question about what kind of leadership Iran is actually being steered toward during this period of prolonged, unexplained absence. I want to flag one more thread here, because it's more recent, and I've only been able to verify it through a single source with a clear political position, so I'm going to be upfront about that, rather than presenting it as settled fact. Iranian opposition media reported that a state ceremony held on July 14th at Tehran's Musalla complex apparently intended to formally cement Mojtaba's succession, instead exposed visible cracks within the regime itself, with hardline factions reportedly shouting hostile chants directed at more moderate figures within the government over the handling of talks with the United States. I can't independently confirm the specifics of that reporting through a second source at this point, and the outlet reporting it, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, is itself a political organization actively working toward the Iranian government's downfall, which means its reporting deserves real scrutiny rather than automatic trust. But even setting that specific, unconfirmed claim aside entirely, the broader pattern it describes, visible strain between hardline and more pragmatic factions inside the Iranian government over how to handle the war and the negotiations with Washington, is consistent with what more independently verifiable reporting has shown about Iran's fractured decision-making structure since the leadership losses of February. The crackdown didn't end when the protests themselves quieted down in mid to late January either, and this is another piece of the story that's gotten relatively little sustained coverage. Human rights organizations tracking the aftermath reported that Iranian authorities moved quickly toward executions, with rights groups warning as early as mid-January that a man accused of involvement in the protests was scheduled for execution, part of what those organizations described as an imminent wave of capital punishment aimed at protest participants. Iranian officials, in their public statements, repeatedly characterized protesters using language like rioters, enemies of God, and terrorists, framing that under Iranian law carries the potential for the death penalty, and that human rights monitors say has historically been used to fast-track executions through the country's revolutionary courts with minimal due process. More than 11,000 people were summoned to security institutions in the weeks following the protests, according to the same human rights tracking cited in the UK government's country bulletin, alongside over 42,000 total arrests and at least 261 documented cases of forced confessions being broadcast on Iranian state television. A tactic with a long, well-documented history in Iranian judicial repression specifically designed to publicly humiliate and discredit detainees before any formal trial takes place. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot, commenting on the crackdown in mid-January while it was still actively unfolding, described what was happening as likely the most violent repression in Iran's contemporary history, and said plainly that it had to stop. That's a significant statement from a G7 foreign minister, made in real time rather than after the fact, and it reflects how seriously European governments were taking the scale of what was happening, even while most public attention remained fixed elsewhere. President Trump, for his part, warned during the same period that the United States would come to the aid of Iranian protesters if security forces kept firing on them, a threat that drew sharp pushback from Tehran, with senior Iranian officials warning that any foreign interference would destabilize the wider region and insisting that Iranians would resolve their own internal problems without outside involvement. Ultimately, despite Trump's stated warning, no direct international intervention materialized specifically in response to the crackdown itself, separate from the broader war that began roughly 6 weeks later over entirely different, though clearly related, tensions. So why hasn't this gotten more coverage? Given how serious all of this actually is, I think there are a few honest, non-conspiratorial reasons, rather than some deliberate media blackout. The internet shutdown itself is the biggest one, made real-time, verified reporting from inside Iran genuinely difficult for weeks, and a lot of international coverage understandably shifted toward the parts of the story that were easier to document. Satellite imagery of military strikes, official government statements, things with a verifiable paper trail. The war itself has also simply dominated the available bandwidth for Iran coverage, because active military conflict between nuclear-armed adjacent powers tends to crowd out slower-moving internal political stories, even when those internal stories are arguably just as consequential to the people actually living through them. And there's a harder truth, too. Mass domestic crackdowns in authoritarian states, even genuinely historic ones, often get less sustained Western media attention than cross-border wars do, partly because there's no clean external actor to focus coverage around, and partly because verifying casualty figures inside a country that's actively blocking information flow is slow, unglamorous work that doesn't generate the same daily headline cycle a war does. There's also a structural reason specific to this particular story that's worth naming directly. A war between named countries produces a steady stream of on-the-record government statements, CENTCOM press releases, satellite imagery companies selling commercial products to media outlets, all of which are relatively easy and fast for a newsroom to turn into a story on a daily basis. A domestic human rights crisis inside a closed, information-controlled state produces almost the opposite, slow, painstaking verification work done by understaffed human rights organizations working from smuggled footage and secondhand medical reports, the kind of reporting that takes weeks to confirm a single city's death toll rather than hours. That's not a value judgment about which story matters more. It's just an honest structural explanation for why one kind of atrocity tends to dominate headlines, while another, arguably just as significant, ends up buried several scrolls down the page. reported faithfully by specialist human rights outlets, but rarely breaking through into the kind of sustained daily coverage a war automatically generates. Here's where I actually land on the bigger question, wrapped up in a title like this one, whether Iran is genuinely collapsing from the inside. I think it's worth being disciplined about that word because predictions of the Islamic Republic's imminent collapse have been a recurring feature of Western commentary for decades now, through the 2009 Green Movement, through the 2019 protests, through the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising, and the government has weathered every single one of those moments so far, often through exactly the kind of brutal, disproportionate force we've just walked through. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you with confidence that this time is definitely different, because that's a prediction, not a fact, and I try not to hand you predictions dressed up as certainties. It's worth actually looking at why those previous moments didn't produce collapse, because the mechanisms matter for judging whether this time is genuinely different. The 2009 Green Movement was largely an urban middle-class phenomenon that never fully drew in the working class and rural base the government relies on for its core legitimacy, and it lacked any real support from within the security apparatus itself. The 2019 protests, triggered by a fuel price hike, were geographically broad but shorter-lived, crushed within roughly 2 weeks through a combination of internet shutdowns and lethal force, a playbook that clearly influenced how authorities responded this time around too. The 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising lasted longer and drew remarkable international attention, particularly given its origins in the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody. But it also ultimately didn't crack the security forces' core loyalty to the system, and the government waited it out through sheer attrition and sustained repression over several months. What's different about the current moment, based on the documented record, is the sheer number of pressures converging at once, several of which weren't present, or weren't present to nearly the same degree, in any of those earlier crises. The oil workers and truckers joining this round of protests specifically echoes the 1979 revolution in a way none of the more recent uprisings really did, since that earlier revolution's success depended heavily on exactly those sectors withdrawing their labor from the state. The economic collapse this time isn't a single price shock like the 2019 fuel hike. It's a sustained multi-year currency collapse compounded by a formal war and its associated sanctions and infrastructure damage, producing the kind of negative GDP contraction that simply wasn't part of the picture during the earlier protest waves. And the leadership uncertainty at the very top. A supreme leader who spent months unable or unwilling to appear publicly during his own father's funeral has no real precedent in any of the prior unrest either, because Ali Khamenei himself was a continuous, visible fixture atop the system for 36 years before his death. What I can tell you, based on the actual documented record, is that the current convergence of pressures is genuinely unlike anything the government has faced in this specific combination before. A currency in near total freefall. A GDP contraction deep enough to rival a wartime economy, because it effectively is one at this point. A death toll from a single month of domestic unrest that, even at the government's own low-end figure, ranks among the worst state crackdowns anywhere in the world this decade. A supreme leader who spent months completely absent from public view during his own father's funeral, and an active ongoing war layered directly on top of all of it, with strikes still landing on Iranian infrastructure as recently as this week. Any one of those pressures alone would be a serious challenge for a government to manage. All of them hitting simultaneously, with the state's own information controls making it genuinely hard for even careful outside observers to get a clear, real-time picture of how the different power centers inside the government are actually holding together, is a genuinely unusual situation, and I think that's the accurate, appropriately careful way to describe what's happening here, rather than reaching for a word as final and dramatic as collapse before the facts have actually caught up to it. I'll keep tracking this specific thread as more verified information comes out, especially anything that moves past single-source reporting on the internal factional splits, because if that picture solidifies with better sourcing, it would be one of the most significant developments in this entire year-long story. Arguably more significant long-term than any individual strike on any individual target. Wars end. Currencies can eventually stabilize once sanctions and conflict resolve. But a documented breakdown in trust between a population and its government, on the scale we've actually verified here, tends to outlast whatever headline briefly surfaces it, and it's usually still shaping a country's politics years after the war itself has faded from the news cycle entirely. If you want the kind of coverage that actually separates verified human rights documentation from unconfirmed political messaging, instead of collapsing them into one dramatic narrative, go ahead and subscribe with notifications on, because this is exactly the kind of story that develops slowly in pieces over weeks, and I don't want you missing the moments where the picture actually gets clearer. I'd rather bring you the version with the actual sourcing attached, range of estimates and all, than the version that picks whichever number makes for the most shocking thumbnail. And I'd like to know what you think sits underneath all of this. Do you think a government facing this specific combination of pressures, economic collapse, a documented mass casualty crackdown, and a leadership vacuum at the very top can actually hold together indefinitely? Or does this look different to you than the crises that came before it? Tell me your read in the comments and let me know what part of this story, the economic side, the human rights side, or the succession question, you want me to go deeper on next, because there's genuinely enough documented material in each of those threads for its own full breakdown. That's where I'll leave this one. See you in the next video.